Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Cord Connects. My name is Moshe Weitzberg. I am a member of the Cord Board of Directors. I am joined by my partner, Fiona Gallahue, who is the Secretary Treasurer of Cord. I would like to welcome you to Cord Connects. Our session today is on the use of social media in education. I would like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Anand Swaminathan. Dr. Swaminathan is an assistant clinical professor of emergency medicine at St. Joseph's Hospital in Paterson, New Jersey. His main interests are in resident education, faculty development, resuscitation, and knowledge translation. Dr. Swaminathan is a deputy editor and conference chair of EM:RAP and the managing editor for EM Abstracts. He is a big believer in and contributor to the free open access medical education movement. Dr. Swaminathan is an associate editor for Rebel EM and Rebel Cast, as well as a frequent contributor to Allium and the Skeptic's Guide to Emergency Medicine. I turn the mic over to Dr. Swaminathan.
Thanks for the nice introduction. I wrote that, so it was perfect. So it's a pleasure to join you guys and talk about this topic. This is definitely one that I'm very passionate about. And I've got about maybe 25 minutes or so presentation, and then I'm happy to take a lot of questions around this. I think that I'm guessing that as you guys are in training, you are going to be pretty savvy about a lot of these things. And what I'm going to try to give you is a little bit of the argument when you get asked why we should be using social media or free open access medical education for education, the strengths, the weaknesses, and then also dive into how to actually apply it. I think we often talk about the concept, but not the application of that concept. So without further ado, I'm just going to switch. Let's see, here we go. Just going to switch which screen you guys can see so we can look at the slides, and hopefully this will work. Okay. So this is kind of the bottom line here. The future is open. We have to understand that. We have to learn how our learners are learning with social media, how this is really part of what they do on a regular basis because they've grown up with it. You guys have grown up with this. We are a little bit on the further edge of this where we have to adopt it, but this has been a part of our learners' system of everything for such a long time now, and it's just natural that this starts to come into how we do education. And the really big ideas that I want you to take home is, first of all, understanding that the openness is here, that those paywalls are coming down, and that information is going to be readily available to everybody. But also, the traditional ways that we teach are inadequate to meet the needs of our learners. And I think that free open access medical education can help to fix this. I don't think it is the answer to everything, but it can be one of the answers as we try to dive forward. Now, what exactly is free open access medical education? The shared characteristics of foam is that it's free and available to anyone, and it's willingly shared for use and reuse. And there are a lot of important concepts in there. It doesn't just have to be a blog or a podcast. It's any kind of education that we then make available to learners to use over and over and over again. And most of us are very happy to have those shared over and over again, whether that be used for the basis of a lecture, whether it be used to create other content. We want it out there. We want people to be learning from it. The goal here for the creation side is that this gets to as many people as it possibly can and hopefully influences the way that we take care of patients. Now, the story behind foam, and many people know kind of the legends and the myths behind this, but they're mostly fairly true. So the origin story here is that there's a guy named Mike Cadogan he is one of the founders of Life in the Fast Lane, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. And he had been talking about the influence of social media in medical education for years. And it was somewhere around 2012, 2013, where he had been giving this talk about social media and medical education, and people just kind of blew him off. As soon as they heard the word social media, they stopped listening to him. And he was bemoaning how it was that he could communicate this concept. And he was sitting in a pub and having a Guinness, and as he drank that Guinness and it drained, he noticed the foam around the glass, and this is where he came up with that idea of free open access medical education. Now, whether this is a completely true story or not, no one's ever going to be able to figure it out. Michael never say, but this is the story that comes behind what we do. But while the concept, while the name foam only came up in the last maybe 5-6 years, the idea behind it has been around for millennia. Hippocrates said, and to teach them this art if they desire to learn it without fee and covenant. Hippocrates' original idea was that the education, medical education, should be given to anyone who wants it, anyone who's able to use it for free. We have obviously strayed quite far from that idea, but that was the original intent that Hippocrates had. Now, if we jump forward a couple of thousand years, this is Osler, and Osler was a big believer in the same concept. Osler is the father of Journal Club, and people give many reasons to why Osler came up with the idea, but the truth is that he simply couldn't afford all of the journals that he wanted to read. And so instead of paying his hard-earned money to get them, he said, why don't we divide and conquer? Some people will get this journal, some people will get other ones, and we'll get together and we'll discuss all these articles as a group. And the legacy of Osler still remains. Journal Club is one of the few places where you can photocopy a journal article and distribute it within a group, and it's still legal. The journals still allow us to do that. Otherwise, they'd be suing us for copyright infringement all over the place. So this idea of free open access medical education, while the foam word has only existed for a couple of years, has been around for a long time. Now, going back to Mike Cadogan and Chris Nixon, these are the guys who founded Life in the Fast Lane. This was really one of the first medical education platforms that was out there as completely free open access medical education, and continues to be one of the leaders in this field, not just from what they create, but from the other sites that they support. We've obviously seen in the last 5-6 years an enormous growth in the presence of emergency medicine in this free open access world. This is a great article from 2014 looking at what it is that residents use for their education. And this is probably one of the most famous charts that comes out of this. And what we see is that 70% of medical learners preferred podcasts. And I can only assume that this has increased over the last 4 years because more and more people are on podcasts. I mean, even my parents who are in their 70s, they listen to podcasts. And the younger generations are obviously using these even more. So this is a natural fit for us to take up and say, how do we use this technology to further what it is that we want? Now, this is a little bit more recent. This is 2013, 2012 data showing the proliferation of medical education blogs and podcasts and websites. And you can see it's a really exponential growth. It's really exploded in the last 5 or 6 years. And this is only up to 2012, 2013. It doesn't include what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years where more and more of this is coming out. And we're going to come back to this. This is a strength, but it's also one of the weaknesses of free open access medical education. The sheer amount, the sheer volume that is out there makes it very difficult for us to figure out how to actually use this. And one of the big issues in medical education that FOAM is trying to address and traditional education has never been able to is the idea of connectivism. Connectivism is an idea or theory that we as learners don't learn from static sources like books or even lectures, that we have a relationship with the education, with the information, and we also have a relationship with the educators and the resources that we get that information from. This should not be a one-way exchange of idea, but rather it should be a dynamic process. It should be a two-way process where the learner gets something from the educator, but the educator also draws from the learner. And our traditional models don't really allow for that. We need to have more of that connectivism. And not that, again, that FOAM has solved this issue, but it is an issue that FOAM is a little bit more adept at dealing with than traditional education. And so all of this is really to say that traditional education is fatally flawed. The way that we have learned for the last couple hundred years or 1,000 years or more than that is fatally flawed. The idea that I can just go to a library, pull out a book, and learn about a topic is ridiculous. There are lots of different problems with this. If you look at textbooks, and you can talk to any of your faculty, or if you yourself have had the opportunity to write a textbook chapter, you know how long it takes from writing a chapter to it actually getting in print, which means that this modality of education is going to be outdated by definition. I would say, excuse me, at best, it's about a 2-year turnaround from the time that I write something that a textbook comes out. And most of the time, it's closer to 3 or 4 years. So the information that's there is never going to be the most recent thing that we know. And again, if you go back and read emergency medicine or textbooks in any field, you'll see that. You'll see that delay. In emergency medicine, we have three really great textbooks for general learning. And all of them focus much more on the pathophysiology or the differential diagnosis than they do on the actual treatment of disease, because they know that that treatment is going to be outdated by the time that book comes into print. Now, journals are going to be a little bit more reliable in terms of how recent they have come out. I would say for a journal article, maybe if you're lucky, you get a 12 or 18-month turnaround. Although I'll tell you that right now I have 3 different articles that have been submitted that I haven't heard whether they've been accepted or not, or whether I need to move to another journal for those. So there's going to be delays here as well. But I think the biggest issue that we're seeing pop up more and more with journals is the biases of Big Pharma getting more and more involved in the way that they are guiding and creating the literature, the journals that come out. And, this is actually an old slide. This is a list of disclosures from a study that came out about 5 years ago or so. The disclosure lists are so long now that most major journals don't list them in the article. They refer you over to their website to see all of the disclosures that an author or author set may have. These start to rival the length of the manuscript itself, and there's a lot of problems here. Many of us in evidence-based medicine have bemoaned the fact that the reliable journals like New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA and Lancet, have a clear tie and interest in Big Pharma. And we are seeing that more and more, making it less and less reliable that we can garner information from these journals. And on top of that, most of us, the vast majority of us, are not experts in evidence-based medicine. We're not experts at dissecting these articles. What we need is actually a little bit of a filter, someone to help us in that process. And finally, conferences. Conferences are great. If you go to a real nice cutting edge conference, you can get up-to-date information that is as recent as the journal articles produced, or depending on how dynamic that speaker is and how dynamic that speaker is in terms of their work, you can get really cutting edge information. But conferences are expensive to attend, they're time consuming, and they don't always fit into our schedule. There are lots of conferences that I want to go to every year, and I just simply can't do it because of where they're scheduled, when they're scheduled, and the amount of time it would take to do that. So we need something better than all of this. With all of the technology that we have at our fingertips, we should have a way to get this information at our desk, at our house, at our home when we want it. And that's really, again, where free open access medical education comes in. It's innovative education. It is trying to move outside of those static old models, the traditional models, and move towards something that fits, again, with our learners, and also with the speed with which information comes to us. Now, as we go through the strengths and the weaknesses, we have to remember that education is not simply about imparting knowledge. William Arthur Ward said, teaching is more than imparting knowledge. It is inspiring change. Learning is more than absorbing facts. It's acquiring understanding. That should be our goal. That should be our goal, whether it be traditional education models, lectures, journals, books, or whether it is a podcast or a blog post. And that last part, acquiring understanding, I think is easier to do with free open access medical education because of that connectivity that we can see there. So let's start with why I think free open access medical education is a superhero. It's stronger. That's the first and foremost thing here. It is stronger than traditional education. This is Marshall McLuhan, who said, anyone who tries to make a distinction between education and entertainment doesn't know the first thing about either. Many of you have heard this combination of medical education as meducation, or if you add in entertainment, medutainment. And it's a silly word. It clearly is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but the point here is that if I can engage the audience, if I can keep them entertained, then I also am engaging them with the information that I'm trying to give them. And free open access medical education allows us to do that. This is one of the ways that it is stronger than traditional education. It allows us to use multiple different platforms. Multimedia now becomes our friend. And while it's true, we are probably not using Tinder for medical education, nor should we be using Tinder for medical education. Many of these other platforms we are. Google+, Snapchat, Facebook even, and Twitter. These are just different ways that we can engage and find our learners. The reason to have a presence on all of these different sites is not to say, oh, I have X number of followers or I have this many friends on Facebook, but for us, it's really to engage the learner where they are. Not everybody has a Facebook and a Twitter and a Snapchat, but one of those I'm going to be able to hit them on. So it's a way that I can reach out to those people. Foam also allows us to have repetitive education. That ability to repeat something is really important. So for instance, this session that we're doing is being recorded and you can go back and listen to it. That's something that traditional education models have never had. Most conferences aren't recorded so that you can go back and listen to it later. When you have your resident conference, most of those are not recorded. which means that unless you're there live and engaged, you're not going to get that education. If you happen to be post overnight or post a midnight shift, you might not be ready to learn at that time. You might not be able to engage the educator to get that information. Whereas podcasts and blogs allow you to decide when you want to learn. It's just in time learning. If it's Friday night at 8 o'clock and that's when you're ready to do some reading or do some listening to a podcast, it's there for you. You don't have to wait for me to be available. And this really brings us to one of the most important points of social media or free open access medical education, which is that it shifts the focus from the educator to the learner. Before the advent of these technologies, it used to be, I'm going to be teaching at 11 o'clock on Wednesday. I'm going to be teaching about this topic. Come and learn. If you're not there, sorry, you're just not going to get the information. Now, the learner decides when they want that information, when they're ready to receive that information. And so it really does start to switch the focus, as it should be. The focus of education should not be on the educator. It shouldn't be on the teacher. It should be on the person who's receiving that education. Free open access medical education isn't just stronger, it's also better. It's better because it uses social learning theory. It uses that connectivity. We know, once again, as we discussed before, that we learn better in groups, that we learn better together. And social media, free open access medical education, it gives us that ability. It supports and fosters that connectivity that we want to see. It allows us to connect with people around the globe, which we never would have had the ability to do. When I was in residency training, which was just 9-10 years ago, we rarely heard from people who worked in Australia or New Zealand or even Canada for that matter. Free open access medical education allows us to get that exposure. It allows us exposure to new concepts that are being researched, being explored in different parts of the world, and it brings that education to us. It's also better because it's filterable. And this is really an important concept of how the internet works, how free open access medical education works. The ability of phone to take all of this information and then allow us to filter it to what we actually need and what we want is really critical. And we're going to talk about exactly how that works. And again, at the end of all of this, what it really comes back to is that free open access medical education is better because it allows us, or it gives us access to the world's experts and the knowledge of the world with a single click. It allows us to get that information at our own desks, in our own homes. And that's a power that we have never had before. And this comes back to what we talked about up front, which is that the paywalls are coming down, that knowledge is no longer going to be kept in the ivory towers of the academic institutions. It's going to be available to everyone, everywhere. Now, finally, free open access medical education is faster. And this may be one of the biggest strengths, although I think all three of these are really important. And when we talk about fast, when we talk about speed, what I'm really talking about is knowledge translation, or what we call KT. Knowledge translation is hard. KT is hard. It takes years and years for information to make its way from the medical education literature into the hands of the people who are providing that care. We've got numerous studies showing that in general, it takes about 17 years for information to move from research level to actual implementation level. And during that 17 years, if that information is important, if it's critical, that means that there are patients who are not getting the optimal treatment for that period of time. And that shouldn't be acceptable to us. You know, I know from Twitter or from Facebook or whatever my social media sites are, news that happens within seconds around the world. Why shouldn't I have the same access to medical education or to medical knowledge? These journals that we have now are fantastic, but there's so many of them. We have estimates that show somewhere around 3,000 articles that are produced every day in the sciences. And that's not just medicine, that's the sciences in general. But let's say that even 1% of those applies to us in emergency medicine. That's 30 articles a day. Now, I read a lot. There's a lot of journals that I review, but I can't read 30 articles a day. No one can. And so what we need is some way to be able to get that information whittled down, to get it filtered, to cut that knowledge translation window so that it gets to us faster. And a lot of this is having trusted resources. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. So in my mind, the free open access medical education movement, social media, it's stronger, it's better, it's faster. If it were a superhero, it would be Superman. Superman is all of these things. And that's really what we are looking at with free open access medical education, with the move towards social media in education. And it is not, again, a cure for everything. It is one part of the solution. So with all of that as a background of why free open access medical education is strong, and again, to a certain degree, I am probably preaching to the choir, and I want to supply this as ammunition for you to use when people ask you why we should be doing this, why this is important. But what I really want to focus on for most of this time, and then again with the QA, is how do we actually use the free open access medical education? How do we use it to foster and build our learning? And I think it can be extremely overwhelming. It is like drinking from a fire hydrant. There is so much out there. We mentioned earlier in the presentation that this is data from 2013 showing almost 200 different websites, over 140 blogs, 40 podcasts. We don't have the time to listen to all of this, to read all of this. We talked about 3,000 journal articles a day, reading 30 of them if we look at 1% of that number. But this applies here as well. I can't listen to all of these podcasts. I can't read all of these blogs. So how do we narrow this information down? How do we start to filter it? So Chris Nixon and Mike Cadogan, the guys who started Life in the Fast Lane, they published this nice article just a couple of years back in EM Australasia. And this is a nice overview article of the free open access medical education movement, where it came from, where it's going, and how we as learners can exist within this framework. And it goes through sites that they recommend, people that they recommend to follow. And granted, this information is from 5 years ago. It continues to be a really good starting place, a place that we can start building from. A couple of years ago, Scott Weingart talked about this idea of the online hierarchy of needs, adopting this from Maslow's pyramid or triangle. I can't remember which one it is, but talking about what are our actual needs with social media. They start with simply existing there. And again, I think most of us are already at that point. We have Facebook or Twitter or some form of social media. Gaining safety in that setting is really our personal safety. Do we feel that this is a safe place to learn and get information, or is it a place where there's a lot of sort of back and forth debate that's not really helpful? And I think we're starting to establish that within the realm of free open access medical education if it already hasn't been there. And then as we move through this, we get to the top three, which really are the goals for consumption, collaboration, and creation. And not everybody is going to get through all of these, but I think everyone should get at least to the point of consumption, where we are taking this in and we are making it a part of what we do for our ongoing education. And as we do that, many of us will move towards collaboration and creation, which is great because the more people who are out there collaborating and creating, the better the information is that we get, the more comprehensive that education is. The other article that I would point you guys towards, and is the basis of what we're going to talk about for the rest of our time, is this one by Brent Thoma, Nikki Joshi, Seth Truger, Michelle Lin, and Teresa Chan, 5 strategies to effectively use online resources in emergency medicine. This was in Annals just, again, a couple of years back, and it really focuses on 5 different pieces. And that's what I want to go through with you guys in a little bit more detail. So their first recommendation is to use RSS feeds. Now, I want to preface all this by saying that I am by no means a tech wizard. I finished high school at a time where I did not have an email address. We barely used computers in school. I got my first email address in college. And I remember my freshman year, I would probably check my email once every other week or so, which is funny because now I check my email every 30 to 35 seconds. Things have obviously changed. But in spite of the fact that I am not a digital native, that I had to adopt these things later on, this is a concept that I was able to grasp, the RSS feed. And what this does, what this is it gives us, it brings the information to us instead of us going to the information. These are the feeds that are coming from these different blogs and podcasts. And we can filter these feeds. We can create them in a way that it, again, works to our advantage. So before I knew about RSS feeds, which is probably just the last 4 or 5 years that I've really understood this process, I had a list of websites that I like to go to for my medical education, and every couple of days, I would go to those sites and see what was new that had been produced. And that's a very time-consuming process, especially when you think about a lot of times you would go to a site and there was nothing new. So that was a wasted bit of time. Now what we're doing with these RSS feeds is I am bringing the information to me. And the way that I do this is with a program called Feedly. Now, Feedly is free. It does have a pay version. I have no idea how the pay version works because I've never used it. And just the free version itself is extremely powerful. And what Feedly is, for those of you who don't use this or don't know it, is it's a butler. It's a butler service. It is basically me telling the computer, this is the information that I want. So I tell Feedly, I want information from these websites, from these blogs, from these podcasts, and then Feedly brings that information to my laptop. Instead of me having to go and fetch the information, Feedly fetches it. And this is like the homepage that I go to. It's the first place I look in the morning to see what's new in the world of emergency medicine and medical education. And we can do everything from blogs and podcasts to journal articles. You can use this for your general education too. You could put the New York Times under Feedly if you want and see all the new New York Times articles, but I really keep mine solely for medical education. So this is my place to go to where I see, was something new put up on Academic Life in EM or Life in the Fast Lane or MCRIT. We can start small with Feedly. You can start with just a couple of websites and podcasts and blogs, and you can grow as you go. People often ask me if I can export my Feedly list to them. I tell them it's probably a bad idea. Mine's quite overwhelming. I have a lot of stuff on there because that's what I've grown to over time. But starting with just a couple of sites and, again, letting the internet bring that information to you as opposed to you having to go and get it is extremely powerful. So as you find sites that you like, I strongly recommend setting up a Feedly, plugging the RSS feed into those, and letting Feedly do the work for you. The second tip that Brent and colleagues came up with or put in this paper is using a podcast app. And again, a lot of this is going to feed off of the fact that podcasts are a major form of our education. I hear from people all the time who tell me that they don't like podcasts, they don't listen to podcasts, they don't have time to listen to them. But I think that we're moving past that phase. If you are listening to lectures, then the podcast is the next iteration of the lecture, except that, again, it's on your time. You decide when you want to hear that information. If you miss something in that process, you can easily rewind and listen to it again. And if something's too basic for you, you can skip past it. So we have to have some kind of a podcast app. And again, what this does is it brings the podcast to you as opposed to you going out and getting it. Obviously, Apple has a free podcast app that comes with the iPhone and with other devices that you can just use that, and that's fine. I use an app called Downcast, which costs a couple of bucks, one-time fee, that I really like just because of the way that it works. It allows me to listen to things a little bit faster. You guys probably can tell from the speed of my voice that I talk a little fast. I also like to listen fast, so I listen at 1.5 speed most of the time. And I find that Downcast has a little bit more fidelity when it goes to 1.5 speed. So people still sound natural. They don't sound like chipmunks. But the point is to have some kind of an app where you're bringing these podcasts into. Tip number 3 is to use compilation or compilation websites to bring quality resources to you. And really what this tip is based on is the fact that there is so much out there, that there is so much to take in that we can't possibly be looking at all of these websites. And so one of the ones that I use is Life in the Fast Lane Review. I'm also a reviewer for them, but there's no money involved, so I don't get anything by referring you over there. And what we try to do on Life in the Fast Lane Review is there's probably about 20 of us around the world that are reading all of this stuff and then filtering it and saying, here are the best posts of the week. I feel like it's a fairly trusted resource without any specific rubric to say which are the best posts. It's really just the ones that interest us and seem reliable. But this is one way to start filtering down that information. So we talked about how foam is filterable, that you don't have to drink from the fire hydrant. This is one way to do that. It's a compilation site of quality resources. Another one that is available to us, and I know Academic Life in EM has linked up with Cord in doing this, the AIR series is fantastic. This is, as opposed to Life in the Fast Lane reviews, this is not always a weekly, this is modular based, it's a specific topic. There's a host of people who review for this. Again, I am a reviewer, but I don't get paid by Academic Life in EM to do this. And what we try to do is actually rank and grade the posts that are in specific topics and then communicate that to learners and say, these are the best. These are the ones that are well-resourced, well thought out. They are easily understandable by people who are trying to get this information. And as opposed to the Life in the Fast Lane, we actually do have a validated rubric of how we go through these sites and say, these are the best posts on this topic, and these are the ones that you should use. So again, what Academic Life in EM, the AIR series, what Life in the Fast Lane is doing is starting to narrow that information down so that you don't have to be looking at 30 or 40 different blogs. You can go to these resources and say, here are the ones who are reliable. Here are the ones that professionals who I trust are saying are trustable resources for me to use for my education. Tip number 4 for them is using social networks. This feeds into that idea of connectivity and nurturing connectivity that we need for learning. This means that we have to be involved, right? We have to exist on these social media platforms in order for us to actually build a social network and to get this information. We have to put ourselves out there just a little bit and see what it is that's going on and what is being talked about outside in the world. Now, for a long time, Twitter has been that platform. I think Twitter remains that platform, but there probably is a shift that's going to happen maybe in the next couple of years, or maybe it'll be sooner, to other platforms. Twitter does have some weaknesses. It's obviously limited by the amount that you can actually write. It used to be 140 characters, now it's 280 characters. That still doesn't always allow for the most interactive engagement. And so there are sites like Reddit that seem to be much more powerful to have these conversations on, but many of the producers of foam have not moved to Reddit. I have a site there and I look at it, but I don't exist there as much as I'd like to. And a lot of the people who are creating foam say the same thing. Reddit seems like a great site. I probably should get more involved in it. I haven't done it yet. But that's something that I would keep an eye on because it does allow us to have more in-depth conversations. But Twitter, Reddit, Snapchat, these are places that we can see what it is that the world is talking about. We can hear the conversations that are going on. And that is an important part. Existing on Twitter, again, is not about your followership. It's not about who is following you. It's really about being involved in that conversation, being able to talk to people around the globe in different specialties that are talking about different topics that do pertain to what we do. This was an article produced by Jeff Riddell and his colleagues looking at who are the most influential emergency physicians on Twitter. It gives a nice list of where to start from. Again, there's so much out there. There's so many Twitter users in medical education. We want to know, who should I be starting with? Where are the highest yield sources? So this is an article that I would send you over to. I think this was in WestGem just about a year, maybe 18 months ago. So a little bit more updated than that article produced by Cadogan and Nixon in EM Australasia, giving a list of people to start with. Finally, the fifth tip that was from that Annals article is to use custom search engines. So to know how to actually look for the information. So a lot of what we've talked about to this point is how to bring the information to you, but sometimes you need to go and get the information. Sometimes you are researching a topic, there's something that happened at work that you want to look into, and we need to know how to be able to go out and get that information. Now, part of that is being able to do a lit search, do a PubMed search, but we also want to know how to get that information from the free open access medical education world. And Google isn't always the best way to do it. One of the problems with Google is that it doesn't always bring the highest quality medical education for medical educators to the top. So often when you search a topic in Google, you'll get Medscape, or you'll get Wikipedia. And those aren't the best ways for us to get the information. Sometimes you get up to date, which might be great as long as that paywall doesn't exist. So if you're at your hospital and you have an up-to-date subscription for the hospital, fantastic. If you're at home, maybe not so great. So how do we filter that information? How do we get what we want from search engines? One way is to use foam search. This was a tool that was put together almost a decade ago now to allow us to search that cadre of information, those caches of information rather. And in this particular site, when you search something, its algorithm brings things that are designed for medical educators to the top. So you're not just going to get the free open access stuff, you also will get journal articles. And that's kind of what we want. That's how we want to be able to search this information. So those are the 5 tips that they go through. Again, I think that this is a good article to read. It's a good article to understand. And what we're going to do for those 5 steps is, 1, understand what RSS feeds are and use them. Use a subscription like Feedly to bring that information to you. If you're a podcast person, and I think everybody should be, use a podcast app so that you can get those, again, brought to you, as opposed to going out and having to search them down, hunt them down, and find them. We have to have some existence in social media to establish that connectivity. So for now, it's Twitter, and in the future, it probably will be places like Reddit. So start getting involved in these things. Start over there, get that list together of people who you should be following and listening to so you can hear that conversation. In addition to bringing all these resources to you, use some of these sites that will actually filter the information down for you and give you those reliable resources. So Academic Life and EM, Life in the Fast Lane are 2 of the best. And then finally, using platforms like Foam Search to actually be able to get that information and pull it to you when you need to do it in that direction. And I think more than anything, what free open access medical education should give us, what it will give us if we understand how to use it, is the opportunity as educators to affect more learners, and as learners to get access to more educators than we ever could have imagined having before. And what that really means at the heart of it is getting more information that we can take to the bedside to treat the patient in front of us. That's the impact that we are looking for here. It's not just, again, about producing and building your CV and knowing what is the most recent thing that's being talked about on Twitter, but rather how does that most recent thing help the patient that I'm seeing? And so with that, I guess it's about 30 minutes or so and leaves plenty of time for you guys to ask questions. I'm going to end the slideshow and then just turn this around so you guys can see me. And then hopefully people have lots of questions that they want to bring up that we can discuss.
So Swami, first of all, thank you very much for a very informative presentation. There are some questions here on the webpage. I think you addressed this one a few slides ago, but I will read it to you anyway if you have something to add. It's actually from Dr. Lovell, and she says, do you have a list of preferred high-quality foam sites? Even better, a list of both basic intern-level foundational sites as well as more cutting-edge sites for advanced learners?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we did talk about a little bit the resources that I sent out or that I had in the presentation, the article in EM Australasia, and I can get all these resources, Moshe, to you if people want to access those articles. That gives a good list of some of the best sites. And again, I think if you use places like Academic Life in EM, Life in the Fast Lane, that'll push you towards those highest quality sites. And again, we don't just want you to be going to the sites that are the most popular, that have the largest followership, but we want you to go to the sites that have the most reliable information, that are the best research, that have the best data driving forward what they do. So I think those are some good lists in those articles. Beginners is what I often get asked because there is a lot out there, and a lot of people start by listening to Weingart on MCRIT, which, Scott's a friend. I love MCRIT. It's a great site. It is not necessarily created for the junior learner. Honestly, it's not even created for senior residents to a certain degree. And so that's not the place to start. But I think there are great sites. If I can give a shout out to my own, Core EM, I think has done a good job with this, although I'm no longer with them. Rebel EM, again, another site that I work for. EM Basic, which is run by Steve Carroll, is absolutely fantastic. EM Docs has some great basic learner level, intro level kind of information. So I think we do need to have those references and say, here's where you should start as an intern. And then as you learn more, as you get further along in your medical education, here are the ones that you should be going to next.
Great, thank you very much. We would like to open the floor up to the audience for questions. If anyone has a question, please unmute your mic and feel free to start asking.
Don't be shy, don't bite.
There's actually another question in the queue. It's, do we need to train learners to be thoughtful and critical about how they consume/use foam? If so, how?
Yeah, that's a great point. We definitely do. So we need to be sensitive to the information that's coming in, how it applies to my local work environment, the patients that I'm seeing, and then how accurate that information is. So again, the some of the resources that I gave, places like Academic Life in EM, the AIR series, a lot of that vetting has been done for you. Those are reliable sites that we think you can use. But what do I do with the other stuff? How do I use that other information that's out there? I think that this is one of the places where foam has a weakness. I think there are a lot of really cognitively challenging, really interesting things on foam. And as a learner, you listen to these things and you're like, I'm going to do that tomorrow. That sounds great. That's going to be really exciting to do. And that may not be the best for the patient. So we need to be able to discuss this in our own setting. What we need are faculty in the places that we work to be able to discuss these topics with and say, hey, this patient with X disease, I heard this podcast by X person talking about this. What do you think about that? And have that back and forth. It may mean that the patient that you see at that time where you're bringing it up, you may not actually institute that new approach, but it allows us to explore it a little bit more with experienced, seasoned faculty. So one of the things that I talk about when I give this lecture to educators is if you look at the proliferation of free education of lectures and podcasts and all this other information that's out there, well, then why do we need faculty at all? Why can't we just learn from this and then go to work? That would save a lot of money for a lot of people probably, but the role for the faculty members to be a gatekeeper is to be sorting through this information as well and say, what's the applicability to our patients? how reasonable is this to actually do? Is this something that we can do in my place, in our hospital that we're working in? So I think we have to engage senior faculty, junior faculty as learners and talk to them about these ideas that we're hearing about, that we're seeing, and then how do we apply those to our patients? I know some places that run, they call it MRAP Club, where they'll listen to MRAP in advance, and then they get together as a group with senior faculty and they discuss some of the more cutting edge pieces of that. I think it's a really powerful way to do it. So that might be something you add into conference time once a month, twice a month, depending on how much it's needed, saying, here are some podcasts that we've been listening to, here's ideas that we've heard. How do you as senior faculty feel about these things? How do we use this for our patients?
Great, thank you. Any other questions? And just to follow up, Dr. Lovell said, thank you for putting this together. Any other questions, please feel free. So Swami, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm sure you've heard many times, and probably the largest beef, I guess, not beef isn't a good word, criticism that some perhaps older physicians may have of the whole phone movement is the issue of peer review. And is it present and to what extent is it necessary? And they argue that theoretically, I could open up a blog tomorrow and say on my blog, hey, I think aspirin is bad for chest pain patients. Don't ever give chest pain patients aspirin again. And a bunch of residents are going to come in tomorrow and say, I'm not giving my patient aspirin because I heard on the blog we shouldn't do it. How do we avoid that scenario, and how do we best use the quality that's out there?
Yeah, no, I think this is it's a very reasonable criticism that we have to address. One of the things that we fear in the free open access medical education world is that Big Pharma is going to figure out that this is where we're going for education, and they're going to start ghosting some of these websites. They're going to hire people to put these websites out touting their drugs. So wow. We have talked about for a long time in our group is how do we validate sites? Does there need to be like a foam stamp of approval that says, these faculty members from around the world have reviewed this site and the information here is without bias, it is without financial ties, no conflicts of interest, and you can use it? And we haven't really developed that system of how to do that yet. I think a lot of this, again, comes back to where are you getting your reliable resources from? So hitting up places like Academic Life, Life in the Fast Lane, and the faculty in your own place and saying, this is a website that I'm using. What do you think? Is this a reliable resource? There are certain things that we look for, and that the rubric that we use for Academic Life in the M is published. It's in Annals of Emergency Medicine. You can see what we go through, and the things that are in there are we expect to know the resources that people are using, have things referenced, inline references, which helps with the validity of it. But there are certain things that we don't include there that I think are important. Who's producing this blog or this podcast? Where do they work? What's their title? Who are they? We know from social media that people can sometimes fake who they are and say that they're one thing when they are something very different. So these are challenges that we need to be very critical of. We need to be examining. Ken Milne, one of my mentors, always says, be skeptical of everything you read or everything you hear. And we have to hold that to ourselves. So if you've been for 12 months, 24 months, 10 years, been giving aspirin for chest pain, and then all of a sudden Scott Weingart says, you shouldn't give aspirin for chest pain, there's a certain amount of that you say, wait, where's that coming from? What's the data here? Scott would never say that, but I'm just saying we need to be able to question those things and say, where is that information coming from? It runs in contrast to everything I've been taught. And I think us as the producers of free open access medical education have to be open to that questioning. When somebody questions us and says, why are you saying this? We need to be able to say, oh, well, this is why. This is why I'm saying this. This is what it's based on. And I think the most reliable sources will say that. They'll even say when, hey, listen, I'm going to tell you something that's not based in any evidence. It's not based in research. This is just what I've been doing. And we need to listen to that as well. So I think that weakness is present in all forms of education. It's present in the textbooks, in the journal articles, and it is very present in free open access medical education too. So we have to be very critical. And we also have to remember that this is a feature of those other resources. Why is it that we use Tintinelli's or Rosen's or Robertson Hedges? Because somebody told us those are reliable resources. We never checked them out ourselves. Every Rosen's chapter has like 200 references at the end. I don't read all those references. So how do I know the quality of their references? It's because people who I trust have told me you can use this. And I think we have to be looking for the same thing, especially as junior learners, because it's going to be harder for junior learners to be able to tease this out and be critical. So they need to trust the people around them, whether that be senior residents, whether it be faculty saying, these are reliable resources to use. I don't know about these other ones, so maybe you shouldn't use those.
Thank you very much. So we have some more questions coming in. The next one says, how do we take attendance and review these resources for efficacy in our program?
So I think the easiest way to do that is, and I keep mentioning it, but is to use the Academic Life in EM AIR series, the AIR series, because Michelle and colleagues have set up a system that you can actually get reports on and say, how many of my residents have used this resource? How many of them have completed the module? So as program directors, and I know they're coming out with a new iteration, but as residency leadership, you can subscribe to these resources and actually have a dashboard that shows you how your residents are completing these things. Are they finishing the things that they're supposed to? Are they not completing them? So if you're assigning those tasks, I think the easiest way to follow it is to use the AIR series because it allows you to do that. For all the other series, it's a lot more difficult. And so a lot of this comes with trust. So how do I know that my residents are reading the textbook chapter that I tell them to, or the journal article before journal club? By their engagement level. Are they engaged with the learning process or not? And so we're going to use those same techniques to figure out whether they are reading the blogs or listening to the podcast as we would with the traditional resources. But again, some of these resources have gone to the next level and figured out how to actually give you information you can use.
Thank you. Okay, next question says, our residents are interested in creating digital scholarship and foam. How and where should they start? I am hoping that by focusing on their knowledge gaps and having them create something in that category could help their retention.
That's a big question, is how to start. 5 years ago, I would say start your own blog. Why not? Get department buy-in, create a blog for your residents to create and put things onto. And that may still be the way to go, especially if you create something that's just for internal use. You can have something very basic. So when they create a lecture, they can also create a blog post that goes with it. Or if there's a specific topic they want to research and get into, they can create something and put it up on that site. So that's one way to do it. And obviously that will take some work and effort to create a website, depending on whether you have somebody who can do that work or not. But many of these sites are pretty easy if you're doing something very basic to create a site for internal use. And your institution itself may have people who do that and may be able to help and support in creating that. The other way to do it is to contribute to another resource. So all of us who are out there with blogs and podcasts, we're often looking for contributors. It's hard to keep up with the pace of creating content. So maybe reach out to some of the people who work on these sites and say, are you looking for blog posts or podcasts? We have residents who are interested. And we often get a lot of our contributors that way, people that we know referring a resident to us or referring a faculty member to us, and they write something, it works well, and we get it up on the site. Sometimes it's a one-off, so they create one thing, we put it up, and we're done. Sometimes we find somebody who just really has a talent for it, and they are really interested in doing more, and it becomes part of their career and part of what they do for professional development. So I think you can go one of two ways. You can easily create something for internal use. A good example of a site like that is Taming the SRU, which is out of Cincinnati, where they have a very basic site, and it has extremely high yield information. It is mainly geared for internal use, but I use it all the time because I think it's fantastic. Core EM, which we created at NYU, was meant both for internal and external use. So that's another example that you can use. And, if you get buy-in from your institution, you can also get financial support for it. They can get faculty that is part of their academic responsibility.
Great, thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the audience? Okay, well, Swami, thank you very much for your time. Tremendous thank you for such an enlightening and informative presentation. Thank you all for joining us. Our next Cord Connect session will be January 24th. So we have no session in December. Wishing everybody a happy holiday season and a happy new year. The next session, as I said, will be January 24th, 2019. The topic will be faculty wellness and resilience. Looking forward to seeing you all there. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.